No one in the room expected her to speak. The Marine general had just made a joke, a careless, almost casual remark about her kill count. A few nervous chuckles echoed across the military hall, but they died quickly. Cameras were rolling. Officers sat stiff. The air changed. Then she calmly lifted her head. No anger, no shouting, no emotion at all. Just a quiet, steady look that froze everyone in place. What happened next shocked the entire room. Because instead of defending herself, instead of denying anything, she answered. And her answer wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it carried more weight than any shout ever could. By the time she finished speaking, no one was smiling. Some officers looked down. Others sat completely still. And the Marine general, who joked first, he never interrupted her again. This is the true story of how one calm answer silenced an entire room and changed the way everyone saw her forever. The military briefing hall was unusually quiet that afternoon. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind shaped by discipline, authority, and unspoken rules. Long steel tables were arranged in perfect rows, each one polished until it reflected the overhead lights. Every officer sat upright, shoulders squared, uniforms crisp, medals aligned with exact precision. In this room, even the smallest movement felt noticeable. At the front sat the highest-ranking officials. Years of service were visible on their chests, not just in medals, but in posture, in eyes that had seen too much to be easily impressed. This was not a place for mistakes, and certainly not a place for careless words. Cameras were positioned discreetly along the walls, recording the session for official records. Not every meeting was filmed, only the important ones. That alone told everyone present that what happened here would matter. At the center table sat two figures who immediately drew attention. On the left was the Marine general, a man with decades of service, known for his confidence and commanding presence. His voice usually filled rooms without effort. He leaned back slightly in his chair, hands resting comfortably on the table, expression relaxed. He looked like someone who had nothing left to prove. On the right sat a female Marine officer. She didn't fidget. She didn't adjust her uniform. She didn't look around the room. Her posture was flawless, straight-backed, composed, controlled. Her hands were calmly folded in front of her, fingers still. Her face showed no emotion, but not from fear. From discipline. She had earned her place there. Not through connections, not through favors, but through years of service that spoke louder than introductions ever could. Some officers in the room had served with her. Others had only heard stories. Whispers passed quietly through ranks. Missions that went wrong. Decisions made under impossible pressure. Outcomes that stayed classified. She was respected, even if she wasn't openly celebrated. The session began formally. Reports were read. Updates were shared. The tone was serious, professional, predictable. Everything followed protocol. Until it didn't. As the discussion shifted toward combat operations and deployment history, the general leaned forward slightly. His expression softened, almost casual, as if trying to lighten the atmosphere. He glanced toward her, then back to the room. And then he made the joke. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was subtle, the kind of remark that could be dismissed as humor if no one challenged it. A comment about her combat record, about her numbers. For a brief moment, a few nervous chuckles escaped the room. Not real laughter, more like reflexive sounds, officers responding automatically to rank rather than humor. But the laughter didn't spread. It stopped. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few avoided eye contact altogether. Others stared straight ahead, faces frozen, hoping the moment would pass quickly. Because everyone understood something immediately. That joke had crossed an invisible line. In military culture, humor exists, but it has limits. And when it comes to kill counts, there is no such thing as a harmless joke. Those numbers are not achievements to brag about. They are reminders. Weights carried silently. The female Marine officer did not smile. She did not react. She did not interrupt. She simply sat there, calm and motionless. And that silence changed everything. The room waited. The general noticed it too. His relaxed posture stiffened slightly. His eyes lingered on her longer than before, as if expecting a response, a laugh, a protest, anything. But she remained still. In that moment, everyone in the room sensed it. Silence in a military room is never empty. It is filled with awareness, with calculations, with restraint learned over years of command and consequence. As the last echo of the general's remark faded, the silence thickened, pressing down on everyone present. The general cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his chair. He hadn't expected this. Usually, a comment like that would earn a quick laugh, maybe a light response, and the meeting would move on. Rank often smooths over awkward moments. But this time it didn't. The female Marine officer remained completely still. Her eyes were forward, focused on nothing in particular, as if she were reviewing something far more important than the faces in front of her. She did not blink rapidly. She did not tighten her jaw. Her breathing stayed slow and steady. That alone unsettled the room, because soldiers are trained to respond, to commands, to questions, to pressure. Silence is rarely accidental. When it appears, it is usually deliberate. A colonel near the back shifted in his seat, glancing toward the general and then toward her. Another officer lowered his gaze to the table, suddenly interested in the grain of the metal surface. No one spoke. No one dared to fill the gap. The joke lingered in the air, stripped of humor now, exposed for what it was. The general tried to recover. He smiled faintly, as if to signal that the comment was harmless. Just a figure of speech, his expression seemed to say. But words, once spoken, don't vanish so easily, especially in a room full of people who understand what those figures really mean. Every combat decision is a burden. It doesn't disappear after the mission ends. It follows soldiers into quiet moments, into sleep, into the spaces between orders. No amount of rank or time in service erases that. The general had numbers in his past, too. Everyone at that table did. That was why the room felt the weight so strongly. Still, no one challenged him. No one except her, though she hadn't spoken yet. She slowly lifted her gaze. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sharp movement to draw attention. But the moment her eyes met the general's, something shifted. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Her expression wasn't defensive. It wasn't angry. It wasn't wounded. It was composed, controlled, grounded. The kind of look that comes from someone who has already faced worse than embarrassment. She inhaled quietly, then exhaled just as slowly. The microphones on the table picked up the faint sound of breath. That small detail made the moment feel even more exposed. Then she adjusted her posture, not out of discomfort, but with purpose. Shoulders back, chin level. She was preparing to speak. Around the room, attention sharpened instantly. Pens paused mid-note. Eyes lifted. Even the cameras seemed to lean in, capturing every detail. This wasn't going to be an emotional reaction. It wasn't going to be a confrontation. And that, more than anything else, made people uneasy. Because anger can be dismissed. Emotion can be explained away. But calm forces people to listen. The general straightened in his chair now, his smile fading. For the first time since the meeting began, he looked uncertain. Not threatened, but aware. Aware that he had underestimated her. Aware that whatever she was about to say would not be forgettable. The room held its breath. No one interrupted. No one looked away. And in that charged stillness, the female Marine officer finally opened her mouth. Not to argue, not to accuse, but to answer. Calmly, deliberately. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, not raised, not softened. It carried across the room with quiet authority, the kind that doesn't demand attention but naturally commands it. "Sir," she began, just one word, but it immediately grounded the room back into structure and respect. No sarcasm, no hesitation. Rank was acknowledged, protocol preserved. She paused after that single word, not because she was searching for what to say, but because she wanted everyone listening. "I understand why comments like they're sometimes made," she continued. "From the outside, numbers can look simple, clean, almost distant." Her eyes moved briefly across the room, not accusing anyone, just including them. It felt less like a defense and more like a briefing. Calm, factual, deliberate. But numbers in combat, she said, are never just numbers to the people who carry them. The words landed quietly, but they landed hard. She didn't gesture with her hands. She didn't lean forward. Her posture remained composed, disciplined. That restraint gave every sentence more weight than any dramatic movement could have. I don't keep account, she went on. Not because I don't remember, but because remembering isn't something I need help with. A few officers shifted in their seats. The room felt smaller somehow, as if the walls had moved closer. She glanced down for the briefest moment, then back up. It wasn't weakness. It was control, the kind that comes from choosing how much of the truth to reveal. Each decision I made was under orders, she said. Each one was made to protect my team, complete the mission, and come home with as many people alive as possible. Her voice never wavered. There was no joy in it, no pride, just responsibility. That word, responsibility, settled over the room like a weight. Everyone there understood it. Responsibility was the core of command, the thing that followed you long after your rank no longer mattered. She turned her gaze back to the general, meeting his eyes directly now. So when my service is reduced to a joke, she said calmly, it doesn't offend me. There was a pause. Some officers seemed surprised by that line. But it does remind me, she continued, how easy it is to forget what those moments cost, not just to the people on the other side, but to the ones who carry the orders out. The room was completely silent now. Even the faint hum of the lights overhead seemed louder than before. The general didn't interrupt. He didn't look away. She finished with one final sentence, delivered with the same, even tone she had used from the start. I'm accountable for every decision I made, sir. I don't need to joke about them, and I don't need to explain them either. Then she stopped speaking. No dramatic ending. No raised voice. No visible emotion. She simply closed her mouth and returned to stillness, hands folded once more in front of her. For a moment, no one moved. The calm answer had done exactly what shouting never could. It had forced everyone in the room to confront the reality behind the humor, and there was no comfortable response to that. The general leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable now. The confidence he'd carried earlier was gone, replaced by something quieter, something more reflective. Around the table, officers avoided eye contact, not out of disrespect, but out of recognition. They had just witnessed something rare. Not defiance, not submission, but strength delivered with absolute control. And the meeting would never feel the same again. The silence that followed her final sentence was heavier than anything that had come before it. It wasn't awkward anymore. It wasn't tense in the usual sense. It was reflective, the kind of silence that forces people inward, making them confront thoughts they didn't expect to face in a formal briefing. No one spoke. Not immediately. The general remained still, his hands resting flat on the table now. The relaxed posture he had entered the room with was gone. His shoulders were squared, his expression tight, as if he were carefully choosing what his next move should be. For the first time, he wasn't in control of the room, and he knew it. Around him, senior officers sat frozen. Some stared straight ahead, eyes unfocused, as though replaying memories they preferred to keep buried. Others glanced briefly at the female Marine officer and then looked away, not out of disrespect, but because her calm words had struck too close to home. A lieutenant colonel near the center slowly set his pen down. He hadn't realized he'd been gripping it so tightly until his fingers began to ache. Across the table, another officer exhaled quietly, the sound almost imperceptible but filled with weight. This was no longer just a meeting. It had become a reckoning. The general cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the stillness. Several heads turned toward him at once. Whatever he said next would define how this moment ended, and how it would be remembered. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he nodded once. A small movement. Controlled. Intentional. Noted, he said finally. Just one word. No explanation. No defense. No attempt to regain authority through humor. That single word carried more meaning than a speech ever could. It was an acknowledgement, not just of what she had said, but of the fact that it had been heard. The general adjusted his papers, a subtle reset. "Let's proceed," he added, his tone formal now, stripped of its earlier casual edge. The meeting continued. Reports resumed. Slides were changed. Voices spoke in measured professional tones. On the surface, everything returned to normal. But underneath, nothing was the same. The female Marine officer sat exactly as she had before, posture unchanged, attention forward. She did not look around to gauge reactions. She did not seek validation. Her calm had never been about winning the room. It had been about honoring the truth. That restraint earned something far more valuable than applause. Respect. Even those who had laughed earlier now avoided meeting her eyes, not because they feared her, but because they recognized the depth of what she carried and how lightly she spoke of it. As the session drew toward its end, the atmosphere remained subdued. There were no jokes now, no side comments. Every word felt measured, deliberate, careful. When the final report was delivered, the general stood, signaling the close of the meeting. Chairs shifted softly as officers rose to attention. "Dismissed," he said. One by one, they filed out. In the hallway outside, conversation resumed in low tones. No one mentioned the joke. No one repeated her words. But they didn't need to. The moment had already embedded itself into memory. Several officers cast brief glances back toward the room, as if leaving something behind. Others walked in silence, lost in thought. The female Marine officer exited without ceremony. She walked alone, steady and unhurried, her boots echoing faintly against the floor. There was no visible sign of victory or relief. Because for her, it hadn't been about proving anything. It had been about drawing a line, calmly, clearly, and without breaking protocol. And everyone who had been in that room understood it. From that day forward, no one would ever joke about her service again. In the days that followed the meeting, no official report mentioned the exchange. There was no transcript highlighting the pause, no note describing the shift in atmosphere. On paper, it was just another routine briefing, filed away and archived like hundreds before it. But among those who had been in the room, the moment lingered. In offices, hallways, and quiet corners of the base, the memories surfaced in fragments. A look, a pause, a sentence spoken without emotion, yet filled with weight. Officers who rarely questioned themselves found their thoughts drifting back to that afternoon. Not because she had embarrassed the general, but because she had reminded everyone of something they all shared and often avoided. The cost. A major who had laughed softly at the joke caught himself replaying her words late one night. He had told himself it was harmless humor, a reflex shaped by hierarchy. But now, lying awake, he wondered when he had started using laughter as a shield. Another officer, younger, newer to command, thought about the way she had spoken, not with anger, not with defensiveness, but with control. It struck him that strength didn't always look like dominance. Sometimes it looked like restraint. No one spoke about it openly. That was the unspoken rule. You didn't dissect moments like that in public. You carried them privately, letting them shape you quietly, if you were willing. The female Marine officer returned to her duties as if nothing unusual had occurred. No follow-up meetings. No comments from superiors. No quiet congratulations. That, too, was part of military life. You did your job, and then you moved on. But something had changed in the way people treated her. Not dramatically. Not enough to draw attention. Just enough to matter. Conversations around her were more careful now. Not cautious, respectful. When she spoke in briefings, interruptions were rare. When she gave assessments, they were taken seriously, weighed more thoughtfully than before. She hadn't demanded that respect. She had demonstrated it. One afternoon, a senior officer passed her in the corridor and gave a slight nod. No words, no smile, just acknowledgement. In their world, that gesture meant more than praise. What none of them said, what couldn't be easily said, was how her calm answer had forced them to confront their own coping mechanisms. Humor, detachment, casual language, all tools used to create distance from memories that never fully faded. Her response had stripped those tools away, if only for a moment. And in that moment, they had felt exposed. Even the general wasn't untouched by it. He didn't mention the exchange again. But in subsequent meetings, his tone changed. He remained firm, authoritative, but the casual edge was gone. References to combat became more precise, more respectful. Some might have called it growth. Others would have called it reflection. Either way, the room noticed. The female Marine officer never claimed that moment as a victory. She didn't see herself as someone who had corrected a superior or made a statement. To her, it had been a simple act of alignment, words matching values. She understood something many never fully learn, that dignity doesn't need an audience. It only needs consistency. Months later, when a new group of officers rotated in, someone asked quietly about her reputation. A senior officer answered simply, "She's solid." Nothing more. No stories. No embellishment. Because those who knew didn't need to explain. The lesson had already settled where it needed to, not an official doctrine, but an individual conscience. When the day finally ended and the uniform came off, the world became quieter in a different way. Not the controlled silence of a briefing hall, but the personal quiet that follows long hours of restraint. The female Marine officer returned to her quarters without ceremony, moving through familiar corridors that asked nothing of her except routine. Behind closed doors, rank meant nothing. She placed her cover down carefully, the same way she did every day. The motions were automatic, practiced over years of service. Discipline didn't disappear when no one was watching. It followed her into solitude. She sat for a moment without turning on the lights. Not out of sadness, not out of exhaustion, but because stillness was the only space where thoughts could safely surface. The meeting replayed itself briefly in her mind. Not the joke, not the room, but the pause before she spoke. That pause had been the hardest part. Choosing calm had required more effort than anger ever would have. Anger would have been easy. Emotion would have been understandable. Control had been deliberate. She hadn't spoken to defend herself. Her reputation didn't need protection. What she had protected was something else. The meaning behind service, the line between acknowledgement and trivialization. She understood the general's position. Command came with pressure, and sometimes humor slipped through as a release valve. She didn't carry resentment toward him. Resentment took energy she couldn't afford. What she carried instead were memories, quiet, persistent, carefully managed. She moved to the small window and looked out. The base was calm, lights scattered in the distance. Somewhere, a vehicle passed slowly. Somewhere else, someone laughed. Life went on. It always did. Her thoughts drifted briefly to the people who hadn't come back. Faces without names attached anymore, moments frozen in time. She didn't count them. She never had. Counting made them smaller than they deserved to be. Each memory stood alone. She breathed in slowly, grounding herself the way she had been trained. Control wasn't about suppression. It was about placement. Knowing where to store things so they didn't spill out at the wrong time. That was the part of service no one put in speeches. Strength wasn't loud. Resilience wasn't visible. It was the quiet decision to show up the next day and do the job again. She thought briefly about how the room had changed after she spoke. Not with satisfaction, but with awareness. Awareness that words could reframe a space without breaking it. That mattered, because leadership wasn't just about issuing orders. It was about modeling behavior, even when no one asked you to. Later, as she prepared for rest, the weight of the day finally settled. Not heavily, but honestly. Fatigue, mixed with resolve. There was no regret. She knew she would be asked to sit in rooms like that again. She knew there would be other moments that tested restraint. And she knew exactly how she would respond. Not with silence born of fear. Not with anger born of frustration. But with calm, grounded clarity. Before turning out the light, she paused once more, allowing herself a single, quiet acknowledgement, not of what she had said, but of what she had carried and continued to carry. Then she rested. Tomorrow, the uniform would go back on. The discipline would return. The responsibility would remain. And she would meet it the same way she always had, without needing recognition, without needing explanation, just with quiet strength. Stories in the military don't always move through official channels. They don't need briefings, emails, or reports. They travel quietly, through glances, tone changes, and the way people adjust themselves in certain rooms. What happened in that briefing hall spread the same way. Not as gossip, not as exaggeration, but as understanding. New officers entering similar meetings noticed something they couldn't quite name. Jokes were fewer. Language was sharper, more deliberate. References to combat were framed with care. No one announced a new rule, yet everyone seemed to follow one. Respect had become the default. Somewhere along the line, her calm response became a reference point. Not spoken, but felt. When conversations edged toward casual remarks about serious matters, someone would pause, recalibrate, and move on. That pause mattered. It showed awareness. The female Marine officer herself remained unchanged in her conduct. She didn't correct people. She didn't remind anyone of what had happened. She didn't need to. The moment had already done its work. You could see it in how junior officers watched her. Not with awe, not with distance, but with something closer to learning. They observed how she spoke, how she listened, how she chose silence just as intentionally as speech. To them, leadership suddenly looked different. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was precise. A captain once asked her, carefully, how she stayed so composed under pressure. She didn't answer immediately. Then she said simply, because emotion clouds decisions, and decisions cost lives. That was all. No lecture, no story, just truth. The captain nodded and never asked again. Even outside formal settings, the shift persisted. In training environments, instructors became more thoughtful in their language. In debriefs, there was less bravado and more clarity. Not softer, clearer. Combat had always demanded seriousness. Now it demanded mindfulness, too. People began to understand something subtle but powerful. Humor has its place, but should never come at the cost of dignity, especially not earned dignity. Years later, some of those officers would move on, promoted, reassigned, retired. The moment itself would blur with time. Details would fade, but the effect would remain. They would carry it into new rooms, new commands, new conversations. And they wouldn't always know why they paused before speaking. They just would. The female Marine officer never became a symbol intentionally. She never positioned herself as one. But sometimes leadership becomes symbolic without consent, shaped by consistency rather than ambition. Her legacy wasn't a quote. It was a standard, one that asked a simple question before words were spoken. Is this necessary? Is this respectful? Is this true? If the answer wasn't yes, silence became the better option. That lesson outlived the meeting. It outlived the joke. It outlived the room itself. Because some moments don't need to be repeated to be remembered. Looking back, it would have been easy to frame that day as a confrontation. A senior officer crossed a line. A subordinate responded. Order was restored. But that wouldn't have captured what truly happened. There was no victory in the traditional sense. No one was defeated. No authority was challenged. No hierarchy was broken. Instead, something rarer occurred. Perspective shifted. The female Marine officer's calm answer mattered because it reminded everyone that power doesn't always sit with rank. Sometimes it sits with restraint, with the ability to speak without needing to dominate. She didn't raise her voice because she didn't need to. She didn't accuse because accusation closes doors. She didn't dramatize because truth doesn't require performance. Her words carried weight because they were measured and because they were honest. In a culture built on strength, she demonstrated a different kind of it. The kind that doesn't demand recognition. The kind that doesn't seek validation. The kind that endures. For those who witnessed it, the moment became a quiet checkpoint. A reminder to be careful with language, with humor, with how easily seriousness can be diminished. It wasn't about sensitivity. It was about responsibility. Combat is not a story told for entertainment. It's not a statistic for comparison. It's a burden carried silently by those who have shouldered it. Her calm answer respected that truth. And in doing so, it honored everyone in that room, including the general, because it gave him space to reflect rather than react. That is the power of calm. It creates room. Room for accountability without humiliation. Room for correction without conflict. Room for growth without resistance. Long after the uniforms change and ranks are retired, moments like that remain. Not in records, but in behavior, in how people choose their words, in what they choose not to say. This story isn't about a joke. It's about what happens when someone refuses to let meaning be reduced, when someone chooses clarity over comfort, when someone answers not to defend themselves, but to protect the values behind their service. That is why the room fell silent. That is why no one laughed again.